Hello there, and welcome to a very late review of Resident Evil Revelations. I am the laziest writer, and if you have any thoughts on the game or the video, or any requests for videos that you'd like me to make, please do leave a comment, as I'd love to hear what you think. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about, so I'll give a quick spoiler warning, and then let's get started. Resident Evil Revelations was released in 2012 to generally favourable reviews. TM. Well, except on the PS4, which happens to be the platform I played it on, but as a whole, the game has been pretty well received. Its events take place in 2004 and 2005, beginning shortly after fan favourite Leon Kennedy was sent to rescue the President's daughter and endless irritants Ashley Graham in Resident Evil 4. It's the 19th game in the series, and it sees the return of other fan favourites Chris Redfield and, predominantly, Jill Valentine. As per usual, it's more or less about a few familiar faces fighting their way through myriad once human enemies, this time in the form of the often fish-like biological organic weapons, or BOWs. Most of the events in 2005 take place on the high seas and occasionally in this frozen landscape, whilst those from a year beforehand are in the city of Terra Grigia, which was being attacked by Day Baobaos and destroyed by the Crimson Morgan Lansdale, the most blatantly evil human out of everyone who isn't Samuel's cousin from the Babadook.
You're not even good enough to have a dad. Everyone else has one, you don't.
So what was my take on the game? Well, it was alright, but I wouldn't go far beyond saying it's fine. It's certainly not a bad game, and I'm glad that I played it, but there's a reason, in fact, several reasons, why it's not one of the truly elite games for which the series is perhaps best known. And I'm going to give something of a disclaimer here, because it will probably seem like I'm having a go at the game at times throughout this video, and as I said, I definitely enjoy playing it. I just think that given the general perspective of it as a good game, I'm more likely to be defending my position against people who like it. If you hated it, let me know and I'll make a video about how it's amazing, or something like that. Moving on to look a little at the gameplay, it was as fun as ever running around and gunning down the various creatures that the game threw at us, and the scanning element, whilst tedious at times, was certainly an interesting addition that felt rewarding when used properly. Although, to be honest, I did neglect it far too often in favour of just charging through the halls as fast as possible, mostly in my desire to hear the end of chapter music. It's majestic. Also, one thing that I can't really suggest is an indicator of poor quality, but which I personally found irritating, was the fact that the series' signature brand of horror was almost entirely missing, which is largely due to the point that the franchise was at, where those values were worn out and needed rebooting in much the same way as we eventually saw in Resident Evil 7. Like I said, I can't really blame the game for adhering to the more action-driven idea of the series that many people had at that point. That said, I still much prefer the tense atmosphere of those Resident Evil games that focus heavily on the franchise's horror roots, which is definitely a part of why this particular title fell somewhat flat for me. 1 year and 1 day before the release of Revelations, Dead Space 2 was showing the world that third-person, over-the-shoulder action horror was still a potent combination, yet that was abandoned in the name of, well, nothing particularly interesting. If they wanted to go down the third-person action route, they'd have to compete with the successes of 2011 titles such as Gears of War 3 or even Saints Row the Third, and the likes of Spec Ops: The Line, Sleeping Dogs and Max Payne 3 would all stand out later on in 2012. Compared to some of those, Revelations does very little to set itself apart from the rest, besides being notably hornier than even the game where you can beat people to death with a giant sex toy.
Me and my sweet ass are on the way!
More on that later. In terms of its story, I find it a lot easier to lodge a complaint than I do to recite the major events, which is by no means a problem in a lot of games, but was a significant part of why I wasn't that invested when we were betrayed by the least likeable character since Samuel's cousin from the Babadook.
Your dad died so he didn't have to be with you.
Or when, well, as I said, I'm having a hard time remembering what happens, even as I read it off the Wikipedia page. I mean, I'm trying to give you spoilers here, but I clocked out and apparently had my memory stolen. I also found it to be surprisingly confusing, not due to it being particularly complicated, but rather as a result of its poor communication. For instance, I was a little lost at one point because of the fact that there are, if I remember correctly, 2 ships that look identical, and we travel to both of them as different characters in scenes that are supposed to be taking place at similar times, but which therefore feel confusing because you're like, why are they not running into each other? This is only worsened whenever Chris keeps going on about rescuing Jill and running into rooms that aren't, for instance, flooded like those on Jill's ship are. It's never adequately explained that there would be 2 enormous identical cruise ships with zombie-adjacent viral outbreaks, or why there's a need for the game to have this happen. So when they give us the explicit explanation later, it's not a twist or anything like that, but more of an, oh, I don't care. As an aside, if you're making a game and there's some crucial information like this and it's not a twist, don't leave the clearest explanation until hours after that explanation is necessary. Also, there was just generally some confusing stuff that didn't seem to make much sense, like how Parker has this really dramatic moment falling into the flames of an explosion, having previously had a fake out where it looked like he blew up and he actually survived. And yet he still somehow survives, ending up somewhere that looks completely different and where he, crucially, isn't on fire, before being rescued by a man who also had a fake out death shortly beforehand. I don't know, maybe that was just me, but any story where we play significant amounts as 4 separate characters and revisit locations over and over again is inherently going to bear a heavier burden of visual and environmental storytelling. This game certainly struggles under the weight of stringing all those together, at least in my experience. And really it's more about piecing the narrative together through the fact that we've visited most locations multiple times by the end of the game, as well as gaining an understanding of the backstory as a result of the fact that this dude is called Grinder. And yes, I may have fallen behind to a greater extent than most, but I think the game has to be accounting for that. Because if the narrative is just apathetically going through the motions with the plot points, and the enjoyment of the experience is almost solely dependent upon the admittedly engaging gameplay, I'm not sure that it's fair to expect players to be connected to exact events in a story that isn't doing the work that's necessary in order to maintain significant interest. Moving on to the characters that capture my attention to a far greater degree than the actual events, there are a couple of key introductions to the series here. The first is Parker, who's Jill's partner at first, and whom we will eventually play as, primarily in the later stages of the game. He's pretty much just a decent guy, and there's never really any question of his intentions. Sure, he can be quite plain, and there comes a point where the game's dishing out fake deaths a pound a dozen, and you're like, honestly, just commit to killing someone already. But Parker does provide nice, albeit slightly useless company throughout those sections of the game where we play as Jill. Or, as he would say, Jill. Because he spends the entire game struggling to speak through an accent that I can only assume is British Italian? What?
See you guys.
Ah, yes, I see it now. But that's more or less Parker. Big tick from me. That said, if you're the kind of person who chooses Ashley over Caden, you might prefer the second new character that we'll be spending a lot of time with, and that's Jessica. Jessica is like 3% useful and 97% sexual harassment lawsuit just waiting to happen.
Jessica, we have a promise to keep. Let's go.
Great. A cruise, just the two of us.
Add to that the fact that she's a triple agent who betrays the gang in yet another highly foreseeable twist, and I don't see what she offers, other than an excuse to stretch out the game's playtime, and, most prominently, a reason for 13-year-old boys to get into the franchise. Which, look, let's talk about the women's outfits in this game for a moment here. Outfit number 1. Alright, sure. Nothing particularly egregious there. Moving on. Outfit number 2. This one seems highly impractical given the kind of weather that they're in. But whatever, you know, it's certainly forgivable. Next. Outfit number 3. Well, this just seems like some black shirt fetishist's wet dream. Outfit number 4. Okay, I have so many questions here, and most of them revolve around the simple idea of why? Why? But ladies, and the 96.5% of my audience that are gentlemen, prepare to feast your eyes on by far the worst example, because none of these outfits compare to the truly abominable attempt by Rachel Foley. It's outfit number 5! Yeah, this game definitely has some questionable presentations of women, but at that point it almost just feels like some weird joke that I'm not getting. Like, did they just see a bunch of horny Black Widow fan art from phase 1 of the MCU and think, wouldn't it be funny if this, but naked? And dead. This argument even holds a little weight with regards to Jessica, because despite the Rachel situation, the horniest part of this whole game is the random woman who goes out of her way to, like, word bang every guy within a 3-mile radius.
Parker is gonna owe me a nice dinner for saving his ass.
And eventually turns out to be a villain. Now, maybe that makes it seem more intentionally ridiculous, or at least a little self-aware. That said, I don't think it makes it any less creepy, and just as you might be coming to appreciate any redeeming qualities that may entail, they once again crossed the line with yet another Jill Valentine cleavage shot. And you're just like, come on guys, not Jill. It reminds me a bit of being in Alien fan groups on Facebook, where a bunch of old guys just post pictures of Ellen Ripley in her underwear because they seem to see every woman as Jessica Rabbit trying on lingerie. rather than, you know, a person or a character with genuine thoughts and motivations, like surviving. This has kind of been a whole tangent, sorry, I was just really thrown off by this obscenely sexy zombie thing, and now for some reason I'm talking about it on the internet in the hopes that they'll do the same for Chris someday. Anyway, I want to highlight that in spite of all of this, there are definitely some great qualities in this game, and despite the lack of the franchise's iconic puzzles and horror roots, it generally excels in most of the same areas as the other third-person titles in the series. I had a fun time playing through it, but I probably won't be picking it up again, because for me this is firmly in the upper mid territory of a 6 or maybe a 7 out of 10. I don't know when I started rating games. It may never happen again. In any case, I'm really grateful that you've made it so far through this video, and if you think that I'm right, or maybe horrendously wrong, I'd love it if you left a comment and let me know your opinion. And with all that said, as per usual, I will see you next time.